From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters.
If you want to stop insiders from getting ahead while you are falling back, you should be voting Conservative. If you are proud of what we produce in this country, whether it's the resources in the ground or the ideas in our heads, you should be voting Conservative.
After 10 months of limbo, the Conservative Party has their choice. Erin O'Toole is now the leader of the opposition, and he's already campaigning. Erin O'Toole replaces Andrew Scheer, who lost the 2019 election but remained to serve as interim opposition leader during the pandemic. And O'Toole takes charge of the Tories at a crucial moment. The minority government Liberals are dealing with the pandemic and are facing yet another controversy that could lead to an early election. But first, the Conservatives are still finding their footing and a clear message. Today, we're diving deep into the Conservative Party. Who is Erin O'Toole? What kinds of ideas do the Tories have? Can the party gain ground beyond Western Canada? To talk through those big questions, we turn to Alex Boutilier, national politics reporter for the Toronto Star. We're talking about the big tests O'Toole faces right away and what the future holds for the Conservative Party. Alex, I wanted to start by backing up for just a moment. Entering the Conservative Leadership Convention, Erin O'Toole was not the frontrunner. I think that's pretty fair to say. So how did he end up winning the whole thing?
Well, I would say that you can't really talk about Erin O'Toole's victory without talking about Peter McKay's failure in this race. McKay was seen as the clear frontrunner since he joined the race, and O'Toole was always sort of seen as playing catch up or trying to keep pace with McKay's perceived momentum in this race. But O'Toole, who assembled a team that ran his 2017 leadership bid, so people he knows and trusts and has worked with in the past, they ran a very smart, disciplined, strategic campaign that really focused on cobbling together sort of the disparate elements of the conservative movement, including social conservatives, former reform types, and Western MPs. Certainly a really strong effort in Quebec, which panned out for them in the end. So, I think his strategy was to try and cobble together enough support to spoil Peter McKay's coronation, as a lot of observers expected it to be, and they were successful in that.
Do we know how the vote broke down in areas like Ontario and Quebec? How did people vote strategically in that sense?
Yeah, we're still working through the data. The Conservative Party released riding by riding sort of breakdowns of each stage of the ranked ballot vote. So we're still working through that. Stay tuned to the Toronto Star for a story on that this week. But, interestingly, McKay did fairly well in Ontario. And O'Toole actually, I think, underperformed, it's fair to say, compared to what people expected, certainly compared to what they were hoping for. McKay was first in Ontario after the first ballot. Leslyn Lewis, a Toronto lawyer who sort of surprised many people in this leadership race, was ahead of O'Toole on the second ballot in Ontario. It was only that last ballot where O'Toole sort of took the lead across the country. So, I think that was one of the surprising elements. The other aspect was Quebec, which is another area that the Conservatives need to improve on for their electoral chances. But keep in mind, this was Conservative members in Quebec, right? So some of these riding associations have 50 votes cast compared to Calgary Conservative riding, which would have 2,000 votes cast. So it really is about organization in Quebec and who you have organizing in Quebec.
Right.
And O'Toole had a few very skilled operators, including former MP Alupa Clark, Senator Leo Husakos, Carl Valet, who former Harper era PMO staffer. They had a lot of very talented people on the ground, and you saw that in the results. O'Toole was very much ahead in Quebec throughout each of the three ballots.
So for people who perhaps haven't been following the inner workings of the Conservative Party, who is Erin O'Toole?
So Erin O'Toole was actually born in Montreal, but he spent most of his time, youth in Ontario. He joined the military and the Air Force. He eventually ran search and rescue missions out of Halifax, left the military and got a law degree at Dalhousie University before coming back to Ontario to work as a lawyer. And, he comes by politics, honestly enough. His father was an MPP, actually, in the Mike Harris government in Ontario. And in 2012, when the Durham riding became open after Bev Oda's resignation, Erin O'Toole ran in that by-election and won. He was immediately put into Stephen Harper's cabinet, or very close to immediately put into Stephen Harper's cabinet, to handle the Veterans Affairs file, which had been kind of a political nightmare for the Conservatives in the sort of tail end of the Harper era. And he proved himself to be fairly competent, or at least more competent at that job than some of his predecessors. He retained his Durham seat in 2015 and again in 2019, even as Conservative fortunes in Ontario tended to fade in those two elections, especially in 2019. So that's the sort of quick and dirty summary of his bio. In Ottawa, journalists who've covered the Hill have known Erin O'Toole for a long time. He's seen as a very affable guy, a very smart guy, policy-oriented. And, there was times when not a lot of Conservative cabinet ministers or MPs really wanted much to do with journalists. And, Erin O'Toole was never like that. He was always somebody who, was accessible and, really willing to argue his case, whether it be at a press conference or in quiet words to reporters outside of public eyes. So, he's a very well-known commodity on the Hill, and he knows Ottawa fairly well.
And as a badge, he seems to wear quite proudly as a true blue conservative. He likes to call himself that. And he almost sort of casted the difference between himself and Peter McKay, who he sort of painted as a liberal light kind of candidate. Did that play into the convention as well in who they elected?
Yeah, I think that was the strategy from his team going in, to try and make the case that unlike Peter McKay, who's the former progressive conservative leader before he merged that party with Stephen Harper's Canadian Alliance, O'Toole is somehow more conservative or a truer conservative than McKay was, despite, McKay serving in senior cabinet positions throughout the Harper government. So I think that, in talking to a lot of conservatives and people who have known Mr. O'Toole since he came to Ottawa, there was a sense that this was kind of a little bit put on, that it was a little bit of a shtick, that it was just sort of what it was, strategy during the election, the leadership election. So we'll see, how he pivots that now that he's won the leadership. If he pivots away from that, he's now talking about party unity and having a big tent and welcoming in every type of conservative, even though he ran an entire leadership where he was suggesting that progressive conservatives or red Tories were somehow an inferior subset of conservatives. So now he's sort of shifting to we want everybody who wants to be involved, in our tent. So we'll see how his public persona or his position on some of these things change over the next coming weeks.
Yeah, and that was something I wanted to ask you about, especially now that he's spoken publicly twice since becoming leader. And the message, or maybe the tone, I should say, so far sounds a little like him gearing up for campaign mode, that he's trying to send a message that it's not some kind of coronation, that he's trying to actively make a case. So what kind of message or vision do you think he is selling to Tory voting base members and maybe to a wider audience of Canadian voters who maybe don't know him quite as well?
Yeah, it was interesting for those of you who missed the convention speech at 1:30 on Monday morning.
Yeah, it was an early one, yeah. Or a really late one, however you want to see
Well,
it.
it felt very late at that time, I can tell you. But I stuck it out, and really interesting to contrast Mr. O'Toole's first speech as leader with Andrew Scheer's last speech as leader. I was just reviewing Mr. Scheer's speech in anticipation of talking to you, and it's very combative, very chippy, talking about the left-wing media bias and left-wing propaganda, talking about the miseries of communism as if Canada was somehow headed towards communist dictatorship.
People will always choose freedom. After all, no one ever got shot trying to jump the wall to get into East Berlin or paddle the raft to get to Cuba. We don't even have to go back into the past to see these examples. We just need to look at the mess happening right now in Venezuela and all the tragedy that it is causing.
So it's a very sort of hard-nosed, combative, I would say it's fair to say angry speech compared to Mr. O'Toole, who Mr. McKay called angry during the leadership race. His speech Monday morning was really an inclusive tone. He says it doesn't matter if you're white, black, brown, any creed, LGBTQ, you're all welcome in the Conservative Party. It was a very inclusive message. And he carried that over today on Tuesday in his first press conference when he was talking about how he wants to draw in, everybody who wants to be part of the conservative movement, has a place in his Conservative Party. So I think, the contrast between, Mr. Scheer and Mr. O'Toole in that regard was very easy to spot. But also, I think it's fair to say the contrast between Mr. O'Toole during the leadership and Mr. O'Toole as the leader was pretty easy to see there too.
That the tone is a bit more inclusive, maybe, or conciliatory versus Andrew Scheer, who I guess supposedly in some ways has less to lose by striking the tone that he did.
Yeah, I don't know what Mr. Scheer's sort of objective in that speech was, but yeah, look, in fairness to Mr. O'Toole, despite maybe some of the tone of his campaign at times during the campaign, he did run on this notion that he wants to appeal to all conservatives, and that includes social conservatives, which was again, social conservatives played a huge role in choosing the next leader. You had two social conservative candidates in Dr. Lewis, and Derek Sloan. As they dropped off the ballots, a lot of that support went to Mr. O'Toole, and that's what ultimately put him over the top. So he ran a campaign that was explicitly targeting those second and third choices from social conservatives, or even the more sort of hardline traditional conservatives, the heirs of the Reform Party in Western Canada. So it wasn't, his campaign, while the tone may have changed between Sunday and Monday, I think it's fair to say that he was trying to be inclusive in both sort of approaches.
We'll be right back.
I wanted to circle back to the 2019 election for just a second, and specifically some of the lessons the Conservatives learned from that moment. And one of the things that I'm thinking about was how the 905 area in Ontario was seen as a vital area for Conservatives to win. And they failed there, that most of the GTA and the 905 went red. To what degree do you think that O'Toole's status as an MP in Ontario, how does that play into kind of that long game plan for the Tories?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because as we were talking about earlier, Mr. O'Toole didn't do as well as I expected him to do in Ontario in this race in terms of the final numbers. And that's, after he marketed himself as somebody who's won a sort of suburban, really kind of partially rural GTA seat 3 times. So he really marketed himself as somebody who can win in those seats that the Conservatives need to win in Ontario in the 905 kind of suburban and exurban ridings around Toronto. So I think that signals that O'Toole and his people have some work to do in this province. But you're right. I mean, one of the lessons, probably the biggest lesson that the Conservatives took from 2019 is that you can be polling at 70% in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba. That doesn't matter in terms of forming government if you're not able to capture those seats in the GTA, capture those seats in Quebec, capture seats in Atlantic Canada, where the Conservatives were quite strong during the Harper years. But I think one of the more fundamental issues that the Conservatives need to sort of work through is the goal to rebuild the Stephen Harper coalition that gave them a majority in 2011 to 2015? Or is it to build a new coalition, or to think differently about the coalition, think differently about where they're targeting? Now, there are pressures for the party as well. We see a lot of anger in Alberta and Saskatchewan directed at Ottawa and quote unquote Eastern Canada.
That was something that he brought up, saying that in his first meeting with Trudeau, that he talked about Western alienation and talked about the divide that seems to be, especially early on, one of the big themes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was one of the themes he carried throughout his campaign. I interviewed him back in July, as we were still in the middle of this pandemic. And I said, what do you think that the biggest issue facing Canada right now is while we're in this global health crisis? And he said national unity.
And if they continue to leave out the ability for our resource sector to get Canadian resources to market, we're going to see more Western alienation. We're going to see less jobs and opportunity for Canadians in Ontario and Atlantic Canada.
So that's something that he's been sort of really putting an emphasis on. But, that limits what he can do, the space that he has to maneuver as well in some ways, right? Because he can't be seen to be just pandering to, Toronto and the ridings around Quebec City in order to add that to Alberta and Saskatchewan and then form government, right? He's got pressures in the West, including within his own party, but also from the nascent Brexit movement and some of the attempts at forming a separatist party, or at least a protest party in the prairies. So he's got pressures on his right flank as well that limit what he can do in order to, micro target those ridings in the GTA and in Quebec.
It's a tough tightrope to walk for any party leader.
Sure, absolutely. This party has deep historical roots, but really the modern party was Stephen Harper's party. That's the only time that they've had electoral success, although some sheer loyalists will point out that they increased their seat count in 2019 and got a big share of the popular vote, but that doesn't lead to victory. I think that the party is really sort of finding its way in a post Stephen Harper period for them, and there are big questions that Mr. O'Toole will have to answer, and he doesn't have a whole lot of time to answer them. Right, we're in a minority situation. An election could come, although I don't expect it to, but it could come this fall. He's got a few weeks to put together, his leader's office, his campaign team, his front bench of critics and shadow cabinet ministers, and to articulate the sort of broad strokes of where he's taking the Conservative Party, all within a few weeks. So there's a lot of work to do for him and big questions to answer.
Yeah, you touched on it a little bit there too, of essentially, do you think that the Conservatives are really still trying to find the soul, maybe the direction of what this party is about since 2015, since Stephen Harper left? Has that kind of been the big existential thing that they're trying to figure out for the party?
It's a big question. I think that it's fair to say, as some former Stephen Harper policy people have been saying over the past couple of days and weeks, is that it's not sufficient for the party to reheat Harper era policies. We saw Mr. Scheer try to do that in the 2019 campaign with these micro targeted boutique tax credits for commuters and parents in suburban ridings, children's fitness tax credits, stuff that the Harper government brought forward and had success with, but voters ultimately were not as interested in 2019. So, I think that they have some big policy questions to answer, but also, what the party, ultimately stands for and what it means to be a Canadian Conservative in the context that we find ourselves in a pandemic where the Liberal government has, drastically increased spending for, much needed supports for Canadians who can't go to work. But, how are the Conservatives going to articulate how they would address this current crisis and the rebuilding that comes afterwards? Is it going to be tried and true principles of conservatism like balanced budget and free trade and private enterprise, or is it going to be something different, something new? I think that's a question facing not only Canadian Conservatives, but Conservatives in Western countries around the world.
I wanted to end this episode just talking about the current climate too. And on this podcast before, we've talked about the We Charity controversy that the Liberals and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, of course, are in the middle of right now. And some of your colleagues, I spoke to them, and they say, the Conservatives, while they're dealing with issues of their own, they do smell blood in the water. That this is a difficult situation for a minority government. You touched on it a little bit there of Erin O'Toole has a big job here. He needs to let Canadians know who he is. He needs to articulate some kind of vision. How do you think that the Conservatives will play into this moment of this pandemic, of We Charity, of everything that is happening? How do you see the next several weeks of them developing what they will be? And also, what kind of role might that play in a possible election? You say it's unlikely, but that it's possibly it could happen. How do you think that will all shake out?
Another big question to end the conversation. Look, it's really interesting. We're kind of seeing a bit of recent history repeating. In 2019, after the Conservatives lost the election, I wrote a piece with our colleague Rob Benzie about, what Ontario Conservative strategists were urging Mr. Scheer to do, and it was to not, return the party's focus entirely on the SNC-Lavalin scandal, which was the ethical breach of that year. I imagine that Mr. O'Toole will get similar advice with the ethical lapse of this year with the We Charity issue. And I think you heard that from Mr. O'Toole in his victory speech, saying it's not enough for us to point out liberal failings and ethical breaches. Conservatives have to articulate their own vision for Canada in a very challenging time. So while I don't expect Pierre Poilievre to give up the ghost of the We Charity scandal anytime soon, I think that there seems to be an acknowledgement from O'Toole and his team that it's not sufficient just to tear down the Prime Minister over ethical breaches. They also have to articulate an alternative for Canadians.
Right. It's this idea of you can't just be the critic, you can't just be the opposition. You need to almost show how you would lead as the main party.
Well, especially in this context that we find ourselves in, I don't think Canadians would be very comfortable we're still in the middle of a crisis, to put in place a government who does not have a credible and well-articulated plan of how they intend to protect people in this crisis. So I think that the context that we find ourselves in makes that even more important than it would be in any kind of normal year, whatever normal years look like these days.
Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that's our colleague, Alex Boutilier, national politics reporter for the Toronto Star based in Ottawa, talking about where the Conservative Party is heading.
That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.